Welcome to all participants around the world. A very good morning, good afternoon, or evening, depending on your location. About 120 people registered for this webinar, but right now I think we have about 20 people signed in, and I expect that more will join us as we are talking. My name is Anna Vig. I'm a Senior Evaluation Officer at the Independent Evaluation Office of the Global Environment Facility. The presenter for today is Dennis Bortz, who is working at the JEF Independent Evaluation Office as an evaluation consultant, and he was one of the authors of the study that we will be presenting today. The second author for the study was Punji Legnavar, who worked with us on this study as a short-term consultant, and Ms. Colleen McGinn was involved as a special advisor to the study. We have Francisco Gamara and Mala Kabir here, who is helping us with the technical side of things. And we also have Senya Temnenko, who is going to help me moderate your questions. The JEF Independent Evaluation Office hosts Climate-Eval, a community of practice whose domain of work is to improve the M&E of climate change and development interventions through knowledge sharing and capacity building. Members of Climate-Eval are M&E practitioners who focus on climate change and related development fields, coming from different sectors and thematic areas and different institutions and countries. One of the goals of Climate-Eval is to identify and initiate new developments in climate change M&E standards, frameworks, and practices. This study, which we are presenting here today, supports ongoing learning, knowledge sharing in Climate-Eval. While there's an abundance of literature on M&E for climate change adaptations, there is less specific guidance on developing, selecting, and using adaptation indicators. What are the characteristics of good adaptation indicators? What lessons can be drawn from the use of indicators in climate change adaptation programming? How can these lessons be extracted into good practice principles? These are critical questions that are addressed in this study to help guide the future development of indicators used in the M&E of adaptation interventions. This study identifies and addresses key challenges concerning M&E for climate change adaptation. It does so by documenting good practices and good practice principles on the development, selection, and use of indicators used in the M&E of adaptation interventions. The study also looks at the steps and context M&E personnel should consider when formulating, selecting, adjusting, and/or using indicators. In addition, the study identifies common themes in the literature and gaps in data, including the role of learning in an adaptation M&E system and the identification of linkages, or lack thereof, between indicators and policy formulation and decisions. And let me pause here for a moment and thank the individuals, Climate-Eval members and others, who have commented on the draft version of this report, which was presented at the Climate-Eval conference here in Washington, D.C. in November 2014. Thank you again. A few points on webinar technicalities. There are various options to connect your audio. From experience, we'd advise to make use of the audio of your computer and with the option, call using computer instead of dialing in. If you would have technical difficulties with the sound, please chat with participant Malak Tech. She will try to help you the best she can. The webinar will be recorded, just so you know. We have to let you know that. The recording will later be placed on the Climate-Eval website, and it will include the Q&A session at the end. This webinar will take about an hour of your time, but a good amount of the time will be reserved for questions at the end. There's no need to wait until the end of the presentation with your questions. during the presentation, you can already send questions in the chat window to me, Anna Vig. We won't be taking questions by audio. We'll only be taking questions in the chat room. Tanya will also be helping me with taking questions in the chat room. Dennis, I'm now handing over to you for the main part of the presentation.
Thank you, Anna. It's a pleasure to be here and presenting this study on which we have worked for over 9 months with the help and also the valuable comments of our Climateeval members and other knowledgeable professionals from outside the community of practice. I think the work on this study started somewhere in August, September 2014, and then a draft paper was presented, as said, at the Climate-Eval conference, on which we got some very good response. We then continued working on it to finalize it, and the final version was finished in February, March 2015, after which the graphical editor did her magic. Thank you for that. And let me start by saying that I'm not planning to go through the study page by page. It's in total, back to end, 98 pages, and the main part is around 70 pages. But I will use the study as a guide. The link to the study is visible here on this slide. And I do mention chapters so that people know where they can find further information on the topics that will be discussed in this webinar today. The study first looks at the broader context in which M&E for climate change adaptation operates. It identifies what some of the key challenges are in Chapter 2 and how M&E is being applied in the adaptation field, and that would be Chapter 3. It then reviews the types of adaptation indicators that are commonly used, that's Chapter 4, and then moves into a narrower discussion of what practitioners need to consider when developing better, more useful indicators. It next documents good practice principles that help define indicators for adaptation interventions, Chapter 5. And finally, in Chapter 6, the study looks at how the evaluation policy interface can support better adaptation policies, and if good practice principles can inform greater uptake of evaluation results as evidence in policy making. Let me start with Chapter 2, and I'll just pick 2 points that seem to be recurring when you are discussing the challenges of adaptation, monitoring, and evaluation. Attribution is certainly a recurring topic when discussing challenges. For one, because donors love to see clear attribution of a desired change to a specific climate change adaptation intervention and grant. This can be hard at times, and the methodological rigor does not necessarily result in a more precise answer or picture on attribution. We are not only talking about changes in human systems, socio-economic systems, but also in natural climatic systems, and not in isolation from one another, but the nexus of all of these influencing one another. We also need to keep in mind that the causal or logical chain between a project's interventions and ultimate objective of adaptation or preservation is particularly long, full of assumptions, and not always strongly formulated. As Andy Rowe points out in Juha Juttu's book on environmental evaluation, we need to focus on the purpose of the evaluation. And if the purpose is to inform decision-making, then a focus on use and influence of an evaluation provides direction in the use of systems approaches, program theory, or expert judgment with a focus on an intervention's contribution. The use of evaluations will be further discussed in a few slides. And I want to say, if you have any questions already, feel free to already type them in the chat window, because I can imagine that discussing attribution and, that's one too far, and counterfactuals might very well result in some questions. On counterfactuals, I had a really great email discussion on LinkedIn with Mohamed Hussain on the importance of local knowledge. And as he put it, measuring the specific social capital of communities in relation to counterfactual analysis could add value in the process of reducing uncertainties and could additionally serve as further risk mitigation. And yes, the local community will also have the most relevant knowledge on likely impacts of shocks and stresses. Moreover, the local community probably knows best which capacities and assets it needs in place in order to adequately respond to climate impacts. And the evaluative focus could be on the measuring of such capacities and assets in the absence of shocks and stresses. Chapter 2 further discusses specific M&E focal areas, community-based adaptation, portfolio evaluations, and policy-driven evaluations, all informed by a specific evaluation use and all with their specific challenges in relation to that. Chapter 3 presents a selection of very colorful M&E framework that all touch upon indicators, but do so with specific spatial scales in mind, informed by the organizational focus and with various levels of importance given to upward and downward linkages to other scales. And of course, the moment we finish the report, there is yet another framework coming out, the Resilience, Adaptation, Transformation, Assessment and Learning Framework, or RATAL, commissioned by the Scientific and Technical Advisory Panel, STAP, of the Global Environment Facility. And for those interested in that framework, I present a link here. Unfortunately for us, STAP comes to a similar conclusion as we do, but perhaps they are a little bit clearer in their phrasing. We conclude from the review of published indicators that although there is a rich discourse on various indicators, there are no published indicators or indicator sets which meet the defined purpose of this study. And the purpose of the study on RATAL was to meet common objectives across the 3 Rio conventions, being UNCCD, Convention to Combat Desertification, the UNCBD, the Convention on Biological Diversity, the UNFCCC, the Convention on Climate Change, and emerging SDGs, plus the GEF strategies. So with the aim to meet common objectives, none of the existing published indicator or indicator sets were sufficient. And they continue, many of them may be useful and necessary, but they are not sufficient. No single indicator will provide any useful information about resilience, adaptation, or transformation without further analysis. And yes, that is exactly why we chose to focus on indicator principles and not on developing lists of indicators or indicator sets. What we found as well is that while the broad reflective questions are provided to guide indicator development and selection in the frameworks that are existing, most of them fall short on providing clear, good practice principles. And let me add that the adaptation M&E field is still very much in development. There is no one-size-fits-all framework, and there won't be anytime soon. And I'm saying this after a discussion also with Anna Williams, who felt that we could have been a little stronger in formulating that. I'm, for example, currently involved in a ISO working group on adaptation standards, and a very valid conclusion there could be that adaptation might be better served with sectoral or thematic guidance documents instead of one overarching standard. Annex B of the report provides an overview of all frameworks with a short description and their M&E focus, either community-based adaptation, portfolio level, or policy-driven. The M&E frameworks discussed in Chapter 3 often vary in the way they group indicators. UNDP 2008, for example, categorizes indicators according to coverage, impact, sustainability, and replicability. Spearman and McRae 2011, and also Oliver Leiter, and Linke, 2013, focused on 3 broad dimensions of adaptation, being adaptive capacity, adaptation action, and sustained development, or what we would call mainstreaming. The Tango framework, on the other hand, focuses on the capacity envisaged to be built by the intervention, being absorptive capacity, adaptive capacity, and transformative capacity. And these capacities can be developed in parallel. Another way of classifying indicators is by thematic area or sector. In Chapter 4, we provide an overview of the various ways in which indicators are classified. And I have to say we had quite some discussions as to what made an indicator. What is an indicator? What is a measure? How does that differ from an indicator? What is a metric? And in Annex A of the report, you can find an explanation as to how we approached these terms for this study. And I think one of the most important giveaways would be that it's best to agree with all the stakeholders involved on terms and definitions and not focus too much on whether or not it's a definition that is, for example, adapted by one of the bigger organizations. Well, unless you work for the bigger organization, then you probably want to adapt that term or definition. The most frequently used types of adaptation indicators do not differ from those in development programming. Where they differ is in how they are combined to measure contribution and impact. And there's no universal type of indicator or metric for climate change adaptation, because adaptation in itself is not an outcome. We need to unpack as to what an adaptation intervention seeks to achieve. In essence, we aim, for example, to achieve development goals under a changing climate and decrease vulnerability to the adverse effects of a changing climate. And we do so by looking at the nexus between the human socio-economic systems and the natural climatic systems, human vulnerability and the vulnerability of the natural systems. For those who have already read through Chapter 5, you might have noticed that in every paragraph and table with guiding questions, we mention stakeholders. And let me be clear, with stakeholder, we mean men and women with their specific vulnerabilities, their specific roles within their community and society, their specific access to resources, and their specific needs. We did not want to make it look like a gender engagement training document, but when talking about stakeholder engagement, be prepared to specifically focus on gender differences, as I just laid out, as well as focusing on other groups within the community or your intervention's target population that might be specifically vulnerable to climate impacts. You want to make sure you capture their voice in order to develop indicators that are appropriate to everyone. And you might find out that such inclusiveness also helps in reaching all the stakeholders and the groups they represent in the data collection phase. Annex C gives an overview of indicator selection criteria: SMART, ADAPT, CREAM, SPICED, FABRIC, and others. The most important is that existing indicator criteria apply to your intervention's context and that all stakeholders agree with the use of these criteria and have a common and shared understanding of their meaning. Expect your adaptation intervention to have a more diverse set of indicators compared to a normal development intervention. What constitutes a good set of indicators depends on how well they capture an initiative's performance against its targets, and whether and how doing so contributes to long-term adaptation aims. A more diverse set of indicators might be needed: qualitative, quantitative, outcome, process, to capture the multifaceted nature of change. And be flexible. the relevance and usefulness of baseline indicators might change over time. Reflect on these changes and adjust your indicator set accordingly throughout the life of a project. And having said that, evaluators, when they do a terminal evaluation, don't always have the luxury to choose indicators. Sometimes these indicators are a given. And it's up to the evaluator then to analyze the relevance and usefulness of such indicators. Chapter 6 looks at the evaluation policy interface. Evaluations with no specific policy-making aim should still consider their policy-making relevance, and if found relevant, provide reflection on how the evaluation's findings can inform policy-making. The role of the evaluator does not stop once the evaluation report has been produced. He or she should seek to actively support different following steps in the policy process. And last week I was in Ottawa and I asked Ray Ritz at IPDET what he thought of these two statements. And he was adamant. No, you should not seek to provide any policy-making information if that was not requested. And the moment you have provided your findings, your role as an evaluator is over. Andy Rowe, on the other hand, feels that the evaluator and policymaker should collaboratively establish the evaluation use, adapt the evaluation approach accordingly, and that, and I quote, engaging decision makers and stakeholders in the evaluation process greatly enhances prospects that the evaluation will be more salient, legitimate, and credible, thereby promoting use. He continues, the key is to focus on the knowledge process, what is going to happen with it, and not the knowledge product, the actual evaluation report. And the difference in thinking maybe between Ray Ritz and Andy Rowe could come down to their experience in different sectors. Education and healthcare are well-established fields where you will often find decision makers who have had ample or quite a lot of experience in the use of evaluative evidence for policy making. The type of evidence as well, the type of indicators, the type of study designs in education and healthcare is also reasonably well established. And this is not always the case in the environmental and climate change fields in which Andy Rowe operates. And this might inform their different approach to the evaluation policy interface. Other elements that can enhance the value and application of evaluative evidence in policy-making processes are mentioned in the report. For example, a focus on ownership and participation opportunities, an inclusive design with a good understanding of political processes, and support of the decision maker as a knowledge broker. And with that I mean the evaluator takes on a role of knowledge and information broker, helping to translate evaluative findings into information relevant to decision making. And with that, Chapter 6 is the last chapter before the conclusions. I want to ask the audience, what are your conclusions as an audience of this webinar? Do email your feelings, your conclusions, the remarks that you have to Anna V. I'm really curious. Do you agree with what is being said in the report? Or do you agree with what I just said in the webinar? And looking at further conclusions, I just pick a few. There is no single set of universal or standard adaptation indicators. And if there would be, we can really wonder about the appropriateness of such a set of indicators. Collaborative, evidence-based policy development is the most healthy evaluator-policymaker relationships when we are talking about, there we go. When we are talking about climate change adaptation M&E. And that collaboration is bidirectional. It is not only the evaluator taking up a role of information broker, the role of translator of evaluative evidence into policy-making relevant information. It's also the decision-maker taking up a role towards the evaluation. And point 2, I seem to have switched 2 points there. We need to be more adventurous in piloting adaptation-specific M&E approaches and indicators. A study by Nicolina Lamour of the OECD in 2012 found that results-based management, the logical framework approach, and the accompanying log frame are the most common M&E approaches used for adaptation in a selection of 160 projects analyzed. Adaptation-specific M&E approaches could be easily counted on one hand. It is impossible to further a field that is still very young if no one dares to test the approaches that are being developed. And the frameworks that are being discussed in Chapter 3, or is it Chapter 4, 3 or 4, are not all practically used. There are some of these frameworks that are piloted here and there. There are some of these frameworks that are really used quite extensively. For example, the UNDP one is used in UNDP programs. The Tango one is surely used in Feed the Future programs. And the one P-Moral of Care is also used in community-based adaptation. But some of the other ones could really do with a little bit more use beyond some small pilots. And with that, I'm coming towards the end of this presentation, and I see that I've done this reasonably quickly. And I wonder if there are any questions.